pleasure to introduce Glenn Bowman, whom I've known for quite some time and admired his work for quite some time too. Glenn has postgraduate degrees in folklore from University of Pennsylvania, in comparative literature from the State University of New York at Buffalo, and a degree in social anthropology from Oxford, which is a DPhil, I believe. His DPhil, excuse me?
I said there lies a story, but let's not
okay. Well, you can tell us the story. Glenn's PhD fieldwork was on the Jerusalem pilgrimage, and Glenn spent 2 intense years working and living intensely, a lot of arak drinking, in Jerusalem between 1983 and 85, in Jerusalem's Old City. He returned to the UK to teach at UCL and Kent, where he's currently Professor of Socio-Historical Anthropology in the Department of Politics and International Relations. The first Palestinian Intifada drew Glenn back to the West Bank, and he has continued to do research in this area until now, while also working on nationalist mobilization in the federal state of Yugoslavia. In his lecture today, Professor Bowman is going to view the Holy City, a city that may not be Mediterranean, but obviously has a lot of dialogue and crossovers, and he describes as, I quote, profoundly compounded and transnational. This is a city, he calls it a city with too much history, a city with too much memory too. So its complexity throws up methodological questions that are also relevant to Mediterranean port cities. How do we do ethnography there? How do we do anthropology? So Professor Bowman is an advocate for the necessity of getting lost. So I'm looking very much forward to getting lost in Jerusalem today. Glenn Bowman.
Thank you very much. I was going to start with an apology that's already been made, that I'm not talking about Port City, although clearly Jerusalem's link to the coast, to the international travel, pilgrimage links, etc., does make it a port city. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. What I really want to talk about is what Katja mentioned briefly, and that is, how do we study places that have too much history and too much complexity? How do we look at a city, for instance, that is revered as Jerusalem is by 3 different, radically different communities, and at least within the Christian group, 27 subgroups within that? How do you look at any of the port cities which themselves, up until the transformations of the mid to late 20th century, had multiple small communities involved in various aspects of trade and monetary kind of relations, who all had engagements with each other. All of this stuff, by the way, disappearing somewhat as mechanization is beginning to change those ports quite radically. But how do we look at the history of these kinds of places? And the argument I want to make is going to be an argument about doing ethnographic fieldwork. And by ethnographic fieldwork, what I mean is intense, somewhat partial engagement with particular communities within these places. And I'm going to talk to that topic in a particular way, but I'll mention one thing first. One thing first I want to mention, because I think this is quite useful, and I always like to quote Nietzsche. Nietzsche writes, there is only a perspectival seeing, only a perspectival knowing, and the more affects we allow to speak about one thing, the more eyes, different eyes, we can use to observe one thing, the more complete will be our concept of this thing, our so-called objectivity. Now, I'm not saying that I want to have multiple eyes, but what I'm saying is to look at a particular place. We can't afford to say, this is the culture of this place, this is the particular characteristics. What we need to do is have various people looking at the place, various people studying it rather closely, and then attempt to look past the material that comes out of it. However, what I'm going to do today is a bit cowardly, and Katja convinced me I can do it. I was going to try to give you the theoretical arguments about this, which would put you all to sleep after your rather good lunch. Instead, what I want to do is to read a kind of memoir paper. It's quite an It's quite an easily readable paper and quite an easily listenable paper. But what it does is set out some of the very interesting aspects of what it means to do ethnographic fieldwork and what ways we as observers are engaged in that we end up observing. So in some ways, it's the etymology of the paper. I won't give you the time of it now, I'll wait till the end of this presentation. But a paper that I wrote about sexual relations between Palestinian tourist merchants and foreign women in Jerusalem's old city. But that's not the paper I'm going to give you. The paper I'm going to give you is about being in Jerusalem's old city as an anthropologist and what kind of ways, multiple ways I found myself engaging with that. So, my flat was elegantly bare. The floors and walls were made up of huge blocks of golden Jerusalem stone, and the domed ceilings, which sheltered the 3 rooms, were lined with whitewashed plaster. There were 2 small barred windows in my living room. One opened onto a narrow passageway outside the flat's door, and the other looked out into the large open area 20 feet below, which was used by the Coptic Christian families settled around their church's monastery. The bathroom window looked onto that courtyard, while a small window which lit the kitchen abutted onto the stone walls of the Greek Orthodox Haralambos Monastery. When I moved in, I stocked the kitchen and put in place a few dozen books, a stereo system, and a select group of LPs I carried across Europe in my aged Renault Tour. Between January '83 and October '85, I lived in the old city of Jerusalem in a small rented flat, perched over the 7th and 8th stations of the Via Dolorosa, and backed onto the precincts of the Holy Sepulchre. The apartment, part of a residential compound called the Johanniter Hospice, which was owned and rented out by the Lutheran Church, had in the past been under the patronage of Friedrich Wilhelm, King of Prussia, and had served to house German pilgrims to the Holy Land. In the early 1980s, the 2-storied congeries of small rooms, wandering courtyards, and ramshackle buildings was for the most part occupied by families of the Christian Palestinians who had fled their homes in upper middle class West Jerusalem and taken refuge in the old city, remaining there ever since as refugees dependent on the church's charity. Not long before my arrival, church administrators had, following the deaths of previous inhabitants, repossessed 2 of the living quarters and refurbished them to rent to medium-term foreign visitors who would pay market value rents and not lay claims to permanent residence. I rented one apartment while I carried out my DPhil research. An American postgraduate study Palestinian student rented the other. Leaving the flat, I would walk out into the aforementioned passageway, which was just wide enough to hold a chair and a small table for typing up field notes, and from which I could look out over through a perforated wall onto the street life of the busy Aqaba al-Hanka, which is a street running up through the Christian Quarter. A set of simple metal staples set into the exterior wall of the building allowed access to the main roof's dome, which afforded a magnificent panoramic view of the old city, which was backed by the long curve of the Mount of Olives, beyond which on clear days the Moab mountains of Jordan seemed preternaturally close. Turning right outside the flat's door, I would move through a narrow corridor between the wooden buildings in which my neighbors, William and Abu William, cooked, and the domed single-roomed edifice in which they lived. This passage was narrow enough that I could, when I wanted privacy, hang a blanket over it. My urge for privacy was probably culturally alien to the setting, but there were times when I felt it fiercely. Once I passed out of the space I marked as mine, I would feel the eyes of the courtyard community upon me. William and Abu William were nearly always outside their rooms, sitting, cooking, or talking, and always, kindly but all too attentively, looking me over, commenting on whether I looked well or ill, and making recommendations about how to take care of myself. One of the really useful recommendations, which I still use, is if you're feeling nauseous, have a good-sized glass of arak. It settles your stomach. Proceeding down the staircase into the courtyard, onto which looked the domiciles of the compound's other residents, I would meet and usually be drawn into conversation with any of a score of other neighbors who would want to know how I was, where I was going, and or what I was doing. Leaving the courtyard for the street or coming back from it, I had to pass in front of a tiny room in the door of which, throughout the daylight hours, sat an old man who, while ostensibly paging through the Bible he held in his lap, looked at me with overt disapproval and marked silence. He also paid a lot of attention to the young women who might visit me. I would mention, by the way, that 2 years later, I was sitting in a movie theater in Golders Green watching a Galilee Wedding by Marcel Clayfie, and suddenly felt the gaze of this old man on me again. Except Marcel had gotten his aged uncle to play the role of a man who remembered the Ottoman occupation in the movie. And I'm looking at a movie in North London in which this guy who was constantly looking me over was looking back out at the screen. It was quite odd. Even at night when I came in or went out, and when it appeared that no one was awake, I felt I was observed. Hints dropped, usually rather unsubtly, pertaining to guests confirming this. One of those guests, an Israeli-American psychoanalyst who I tempted on the terra incognita of the old city with tales of its cultural fecundity, commented on retiring to my flat after a tour of the then pulsing streets of the Muslim and Christian quarters, that, quote, here in the middle of this amazing otherness, you've moored your apartment like a small boat, and that you're able to withdraw into to be at home. I'd like to unpack that image of the Fieldwork residence as a floating piece of home, and to suggest ways in which the space of that small boat might not only lend itself to the work of understanding cultural alterity, but also carry the researcher into unanticipated waters. Being at home while away is far from unusual amongst those who pass as travelers. John Ashbery, in his 1961 essay on Raymond Roussel, quotes, without attribution, Michel Lerisse's assertion that Roussel never really traveled. It seems likely that the outside world never broke through into the universe he carried within him, and that in all the countries he visited, he twice went around the globe. He saw only what he had put there in advance, elements which corresponded absolutely with that universe that was peculiar to him. Catherine Schmidt notes a similar phenomena when she refers to guided tours as insulated adventures, wherein tourists, convinced that they are embarking on an encounter with foreign places and inhabitants, nonetheless make sure that the windowed walls of their hotels, the sheltering shells of their tour buses, and the cosseting discourses of their guides protect them from confrontations that might force them to question either their positions or their identities. Second home ghettos populated by foreign nationals who insist on being abroad in the near exclusive company of co-nationals also make an evident cultural narcissism without frontiers. Such ways of being at home in foreign places are more likely to strengthen monocultural identifications than to dissolve them. And work on diasporic identities has suggested that when subjects abroad self-isolate from the other identification with a home, self-isolate from the other, identification with a homeland is likely to be even stronger than it would have been at home. You can see this in the nationalisms of people outside their home territories. In some ways, I was not, at least initially, unlike the tourist in his or her insulated adventure, though what protected me from disconcerting alterity was not guides or tour buses, but instead my research. Sorry, I was looking at my watch. But instead my research plans and the set of procedures which social scientists call method. My research was on Christian pilgrims and their relations to the Holy Land and to other pilgrim communities. It was clear to me who I had to speak with and what sort of information I was intent on collecting. I met with priests and patriarchs from churches, ranging from the Eastern Orthodox to Western Protestants. I interviewed and traveled with pilgrim groups as diverse as Ethiopian Orthodox and Christian Zionists. And I observed and talked with officiants of the tourism trade, from the street level of tour guides and bus drivers to the offices of the Ministry of Tourism. My methodology was a combination of participant observation, open-ended interviewing, and a modicum of questionnaire distribution. And whilst I had some wonderful experiences traveling with, talking with, and simply observing a fabulous range of characters, none of this came home with me, other than in the form of notes I would spend hours typing up on an aging portable electric typewriter. I very much located myself in the classical anthropological position of disembodied viewer, positioned like a Descartesian eye looking upon and analyzing a setting and its subjects without in any way identifying with the locale studied. As an unbeliever and an anthropologist, I could play at participation in pilgrimage and its accoutrements so as to discern their informing logics, but my engagements with the worlds of priests and pilgrims was always at a distance. When I brought my work home with me, it was as observations and ideas I worked through and analyzed in my own private space. There was also an element of flaneur, I'm using the Benjamin term, in my early relation to the old city, and this too was not unlike that established by the traveler, tourist, or second homeowner with regard to the sites they variously inhabit. Here one appropriates a scene by looking upon it as though it had been provided for one's own pleasure and stimulation. As long as I did not feel the gaze of the city looking back on me, I could voraciously feed my senses with the smells, sights, sounds, and on the more crowded thoroughfares, precipice of street, which by day heaved with masses gathered from all over the world, and by night were eerily empty and troubled only by whiffs of incense, rotting food, and the echoes of distant ecclesiastical chanting and the clanking of Uzis, the machine guns carried by patrolling Israeli soldiers. I spent hours walking through the city night and day with a pair of cameras around my neck, one with color film, one with black and white, taking in the rich otherness of a city marked with the traces of 3,000 years of continuous human occupation. Once beyond the neighborhood gaze, I had to pass through between my flat and the street. I could, like Benjamin's flaneur, once again feel myself at home while being away. And Benjamin writes, "The street becomes a dwelling for the flaneur. He is as much at home among the facades of houses as a citizen is in his four walls. To him, the shiny enamel signs of businesses are at least as good as a wall ornamented as an oil painting. At least as good a wall ornament as an oil painting is to the bourgeois in his salon. The walls of his desk against which he presses his notebooks, newsstands are his libraries, and the terraces of cafes are the balconies from which he looks down on his household after his work is done." This is this disembodied gaze. The situation wasn't idyllic insofar as being home alone can be lonely, regardless of how wonderful the housing. And I did, in the first few weeks of living in the old city, often resort to the oddly American setting of Hebrew University, where I held a Lady Davis Fellowship and where I could meet and talk with scholars who, like me, were living in a land other than that in which they had been born and raised. About 3 weeks after I moved into the Johannata hospice, I was wriggling out of my Renault, which I had to park tightly against the wall of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate, on one of the few vehicle-accessible streets in the dense fabric of the old city, when I was hailed by a Palestinian man in his middle 20s. He spoke excellent English and engaged me in a conversation which began with a moan about the difficulty of finding parking within the city walls, and moved fairly quickly to a disquisition on the refusal of the Israeli government to invest in the old city's infrastructure. I was not surprised to be addressed in English. I knew from my observations of street merchants that they were able to address tourists appropriately in any of up to half a dozen different languages, but was taken aback by Fayet's apparent warmth and his evidence intelligence. Unlike my neighbors, whose solicitude seemed to mask an anxiety that I would somehow corrupt their habitat, probably meaningful, Fayet seemed to be simply friendly, and within a few minutes I found myself sitting with him in the Jock Inn, a local hostel for tourists, drinking the first of a number of Maccabi beers. Although I quickly learned a fair bit about Fayek, he lived in Abu Dis, was Muslim, and ran a small jewelry shop on Christian Quarter Road. What amazed me was that there was little I could tell him about myself and what I was doing in the old city that he didn't, at least in outline, already know. Clearly, despite my sense of being able to move invisibly, quotes, through the city's streets, I had been the focus of more than casual attention. What Fayek knew was a distillation of information from several sources, compiled in that incredible collective cerebrum which throbbed at the heart of the Palestinian city. Over the next couple of weeks, Fayek and I spent a lot of time together. I got used to sitting in his shop watching him string beads or render coins antique. You could buy basically stock Hasmonean coins made in the Far East that you then play a blowtorch over, and they become antiques very quickly and very, very sellable. Render coins antique while we chatted like any new friends about whatever came to mind. Occasionally tourists would enter and Fayek would gauge what language to greet them in, often uncannily knowing whether they were Swedes, Italians, French, or British before they'd even said a word. Offer them small, bittersweet cups of coffee, ask them about their travels, and eventually try to sell them some of his goods. I began on my daily trips to the Holy Sepulchre to observe and interview pilgrims, to look forward to stopping off for a while at Vayak's shop. I also found myself becoming somewhat protective of my friend, intervening on occasions when bargaining became hostile, either to vouch for his integrity or to counter Israeli guides' assertions to potential customers that Vayak, like all Palestinian street merchants, was trying to take their money to fund the PLO. After the fortnight or so it took Vayak to adequately check me out, he began introducing me to other colleagues on the street, although it was clear that introductions were formal and only informative to me, as those merchants already knew who I was. Within a very short while, my daily forays to do proper fieldwork grew more and more impeded as I got drawn into people's shops, being called upon to talk with them, have a cup of coffee, chat, or whatever, and I'm skipping over a little bit, but effectively, either I could realize that I was going to be late to whatever interviews and appointments I had made because I was going to be trapped in these shops, or I would have to go out onto the more busy streets and basically hide among groups of tourists going through so as not to be called into people's shops. It was an incredibly convivial place. People were sitting around. They didn't have anything to do, and they really liked to chat. The hours I spent sitting with my new friends in their small shops introduced me not only to the complex dynamics of a tourist market, but as well to the rich diversity of their life stories and aspirations, and of the shopkeepers who peopled it. Most of the merchants were like Vayak edge people, insofar as they had chosen to make a living by dealing with foreign tourists and with the Israeli nationals who would shop in the Arab quarters on the Sabbath when Jewish West Jerusalem closed down. This was potentially lucrative but simultaneously corrupting territory, and as a result, the normal life course followed by Palestinian men was here kept on hold. Most of the men I came to know were in their mid to late 20s or, like me, early 30s. They were Christians and Muslims, some were college educated, some came from old Jerusalem merchant families, whilst others were parvenus from Hebron and villages to the south. Nearly all were unmarried. The Palestinian practice of bride price rendered marriage inexpensive a proposition, and while merchants would often talk of getting married when they had made enough money to make that possible, the talk tended to be abstract. Profits were restricted by the fierce competition of a buyer's market, and Palestinian girlfriends and fiancés were notable by their absence. There was, however, a perpetual pursuit of foreign women, and although in a number of cases that would eventually lead to marriage and consequent expatriation, for the most part it was a serious game in which the pleasure of seduction was paired with the important business of demonstrating to other merchants that one was able to entice and conquer foreigners. Whether it was my own edge position as an expatriate anthropologist in the field, or the fact that, like them, I was a single man, I found myself feeling uncannily at home in their company. Some of this was a generous camaraderie. It was nearly impossible for me, for instance, to pay for their or even my own drinks. And some was a sense of, for the first time since I was 16 or so, having a circle of close male friends. My experience of growing up, certainly in New York, but I suspect in the West more generally, is by the time you hit 13 or 14 or 15, you're basically expected to start shadowing forth the nuclear family and have a girlfriend or a boyfriend and not be hanging with the crowd. This was the first time because of the absence of women in a sense, or the fact that they were basically within the households, that I found myself in a crowd, a male crowd. And it was quite an interesting experience. The game of sexual competition was also engaging, although my aims were somewhat less economic than theirs. One might, however, wonder what was in this relationship with a half dozen or so Shabbat youth with whom I came to spend increasing amount of times. An element I like to think was simple friendship, although we as anthropologists know that friendship is compounded of a give and take of self-interest and interest in the other. Certainly, I provided them with some relief from the boredom of sitting in shops all day waiting for customers to wander in, make a couple of stereotypically hostile inquiries, and wander out. I was around for a more sustained period, would bring to them stories and perspectives from outside the limits of the market, was interested in what they had to say, and would provide occasional amusement by playing the culturally obtuse fool. Furthermore, competition was fierce in a setting where a large number of dealers were all selling pretty much the same sorts of things, to a limited clientele, and no one trusted their neighbors very far. To maintain one's status, an extremely valuable commodity, one had to protect oneself constantly from the impugnings of neighbors and friends who were simultaneously competitors in what was the zero-sum game of selling and seducing. Here I played the role of outsider-insider. People could talk to me about various personal issues, including those pertaining to business difficulties and problems with their other friends, without putting the information divulged into general circulation. Finally, my flat, though small, was neutral ground, belonging to no one in particular, and more to the point, to none of the extended families within which the Shabbat lived. Although it was very rare for any of my Palestinian friends to visit on their own, the flat became a place where a number of us could get together, with or without tourist girlfriends, prepare a barbecue, listen to music, drink arak, and smoke a water pipe. After inquiring in the course of the day whether or not I would be happy to host a barbecue in the evening, a couple of guys would go out and shop for lamb, vegetables, and arak, and afterwards we would all gather after the shops closed to set up a grill on my balcony, cook meat, make salad, and then sit around till well past midnight, talking, playing music, basically just enjoying ourselves. Just as the flat provided sort of liminal terrain for me, a locale moored between home and the field, so too it was for my friends, a place that was simultaneously part of the old city and apart from it. Anywhere else that they could get together was somehow entailed in the demands and conflicts of family and community. Hosting friends at each other's homes involved elaborate and interminable rituals of respect and decorum with elders, while meetings in local hostels and pubs seemed inevitably to end up in punch-ups between themselves and other local guys, between themselves and tourist men, or between each other. Only in my flat would I witness anywhere from 6 to 10 of these men, sometimes but not always with foreign women, sitting around peacefully sharing food and drink and talking comfortably and openly with each other. Here my second home became a home away from home for them, and as for me, it felt homely precisely because it wasn't home for me as for them. It's hard to say in retrospect what my flat did in the long term for my friends. Although they were both Muslim and Christian, educated and barely schooled, relatively well off and just scraping by, they shared, like the rest of their co-nationals, the experience of living under a military occupation, which was to grow far more brutal after the imposition of Rabin's iron fist policy in October 1985. In the early 80s, they had seemed to ignore the encompassing political situation because, I thought, they were too deeply invested in the local war of market competition to pay it much regard. After that, pretending became much more difficult, and eventually the audience for whom one pretended and the market one struggled to dominate leached away. Israeli settlement expansion within and the systematic economic isolation of the Palestinian sectors of the old city combined with escalating Palestinian militancy to render tourism and shopping unviable. My recent attempts in spring of this year to track down friends found 3 dead, 2 suicides, 1 heroin overdose, and 6 living outside the country. I could find no trace of the rest. Well, there is no way I can believe in the face of the ongoing history of disposition and displacement that these moments of communion worked some enduring good in the lives of these men. I can nonetheless hope that those who remain alive occasionally think back with pleasure to those nights afloat above the souk, above the market. For me, the flat and the home in the street, which augmented it, radically changed both my fieldwork and my life. When I first moved into the old city, my apartment and the street, the unholy sectors of the old city, were no more than accessories to the research I planned to do. The reason I was in Jerusalem was to carry out fieldwork on pilgrims in the holy places, and in that task, my flat served as a place to write, to eat, and to sleep. I also used it when the strains of fieldwork and of being a stranger in a strange land got to be too much, as a place in which to take cover with my books and my music. The streets of the souk served initially as routes to the shrines and churches in which I needed to observe, photograph, and interview priests and pilgrims. Quite quickly, they became an engaging distraction on my ways to and from work, but I was initially too locked into my pre-planned agenda to envision them as objects of study. Even when, speaking through Fayak, the street called out to me and I responded, I still did not see the Palestinian city and its inhabitants as part of my fieldwork. For quite a while I considered Fayak, Jack, Garo, Salim, Anis, Mustafa, Suhail, Albert, Nabil, Francis, and Ibrahim, to be friends with whom it was fun to talk, to drink, and chase around the city, but certainly not as subjects on which to turn an anthropological gaze. It was when I began to identify with the street merchants that, ironically, I began to see them anthropologically. This was prompted by the recognition that accompanying their recurrent discussions of selling was a leitmotif of embroidered tales, of trying and occasionally succeeding in seducing foreign women. Myself caught by the sexual fervor of the market, yet frustrated to see friends compulsively trapped in a game which in real terms they were bound to lose. I struggled to link the mercantile and prestige economies and worked on the analysis of what in time would come to be called, excuse my language, but it was published this way in 1989, fucking tourists. That study was one of power, or more accurately, of fantasies of power in the face of political and economic impotence. And it was the issue of power which began to make me see the street as an object of anthropological concern. Over the months I lived there, I listened to friends and neighbors' stories of maltreatment by police, tax collectors, and city administrators, repeatedly heard Israeli tour guides on the street malign the merchants' prospective customers, and came to share the frisson of conjoined fear and impotent rage as armed soldiers or settlers passed by. Whether sensitivity to some unjust power I brought with me from my first home resonated with the quotidian impression I was growing increasingly aware of, or whether I simply found myself empathetically identifying with the people I was associated with, I found myself feeling more and more Palestinian in my responses to symptoms of what I was coming to recognize as the situation. In time, I came not only to sense in my friends and neighbors' gestures, intonations, and moods the weight of a normalized military occupation, but also to feel that weight bear on me. In this way, the situation on the street became my concern, in a way Christian pilgrims and pilgrimage, although mediated through Oxford and my thesis, never could. Here I was not watching others from the objective vantage point of a social scientist, but observing myself and others at home in the world. Anthropology here became an analysis of the social world as it was refracted through the self's experiences, truly what we call participant observation. This at-homeness was in my case significantly qualified by the fact that I've always already had other homes elsewhere. When I speak of home with reference to the various places in which I have lived, I do not simply mean physical places, but as well a collection of practices, passions, and perspectives associated with those places. Those ways of seeing and of being are themselves at least in part transportable. The examples cited above of travelers who never really leave home suggest that for some it is possible to live abroad as though they had brought their homes with them. Even, however, when one finds oneself identifying with a particular life of another place, one rarely finds that one has gone fully native. There always remains in one existential toolkit ways of understanding emotional responses and strategies of coping brought from previous residencies. I had brought with me to Jerusalem, among other things, my anthropological and analytic ways of thinking, with the intention of working on topics such as sanctification, ritual construction of place, and the multivalence of memorialization. Under the pressure of what became a fierce need to make sense of and thus take at least cognitive control of the brutalities of everyday life in Palestine, these were remachined into tools for understanding, among other things, the ways ethnic domination and economic marginalization impacted upon individuals. At the time, I saw these tools as having potential for assisting and mobilizing my friends on the street towards self-defense and liberation. But I realized subsequently that to have thought my theorizing had provided them with anything more than a bit of bitter entertainment was hubristic. For me, however, practicing anthropology in a second home made me at home with the discipline of anthropology. I learned in Jerusalem that I am, with the others surrounding me, the subject